Hello, welcome back. We're here for another week of healthcare insurance and billing. And this week we're going to focus on chapters 3 and 4 that cover revenue management. And again, when we talk about this chapter can be thought of in these components: revenue management, how we manage the patient, including registration, the encounter form, and a term you'll be familiar with, charge master, how an insurance claim is processed, and less important, but important when you're working in the field, is the idea of posting charges to patient accounts. In other words, just like a store account, patients have an account at a medical practice and they get debited and credited to their accounts and so on. And then probably very important as well is the monitoring and auditing for revenue management. So when we talk about revenue management, we're talking about things that facilitate maximal reimbursement for the medical practice. In other words, we're looking at maximizing revenue capture for all the healthcare services that are provided to the patient in the medical office setting. Ideally, this means that they need to be accurate, optimal, and timely. So here's a knowledge check activity that you should get if you've read chapter 3. What do you think is the difference between revenue management globally and revenue cycle management? What methods will you use to learn the meanings of each so that you will develop a true understanding of each concept? Let's pause and we'll take a look on the next slide. Revenue management is the process that healthcare facilities and medical offices ensure their viability by increasing revenue and improving cash flow. In other words, it does no good if we submit a bunch of claims, but we're not actually getting paid on them. Ideally, we want to do this while keeping the patient's experience customer focused and as pleasant as possible. This involves, prior to admitting a patient, pre-admission testing, pre-authorization, and registration. Revenue cycle management is the revenue cycle process. Typically, you see this expressed in a circular diagram, as is mentioned in your book. This begins with scheduling the appointment, registering the patient, and when it's been concluded, the process, of course, includes reimbursement. And over here, we see our diagram that we alluded to earlier, and kind of starts right here, if you will. With the patient scheduling an appointment, registering, the charge capture, the diagnosis and procedure coding, the discharge processing, the claim being processed, resubmitting it, the reimbursement from the third party, in other words, the insurance company, paper billing, the appeals, collections, and reimbursement. And again, very common to see these steps outlined in this kind of circular motion. But if you think about it, they're all very, very important. One doesn't supersede the other. If we don't have the correct patient demographics entered at the time of the appointment, that gets everything off to a flawed start, and the medical office or facility does not get paid correctly. Managing patients usually involves some sort of extensive check-in procedure. We want to make sure that the correct patient is registering for the services. And a term that you'll hear related to this is the guarantor. In other words, the person who's responsible for paying the charges. You can think of par versus non-par as in-network versus out-of-network. Your text also goes into some finer details about primary, secondary, the birthday rule, and so on. These are critical to understand, as many times patients will have more than one insurance. Established patients, if you think about it, involve less check-in. So in order to bill these patients correctly, we have to make sure that their universe is established. Kind of a similar concept that those of you who have taken CPT coding are probably familiar with. When you have the encounter forms and the charge masters, we can kind of think of the encounter forms as the super bills, and there's several examples of these in your text. These have a combination of codes and demographic information to ensure that the patient gets their charges captured correctly. The charge master, sometimes called the charge description master, is something that we see when somebody goes to a hospital and maybe they're going for non-hospital related services, labs, x-rays, what have you. All of those have appropriate codes. So they come in, your book gets into the example of the radiology example, and these are now electronically captured. And again, these things with all the new coding guidelines that come out, new codes being added, deleted, what have you. Very important to have your charge master up to date. Your book has this facsimile of an encounter form. So it talks about level 2. Note over here, we have our old friends from CPT coding, right? New. Level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 established, right? We also have the office procedures, and these, of course, being the codes. And then over here, we have ICD-10 CM codes. If you've taken that class, these will all look really familiar. And also note that, again, what happens with the outpatient setting that's different than coding things from an inpatient setting. Well, we all know from ICD-10 code, if we don't have an established diagnosis, we will code the symptoms, such as abdominal pain or abnormal heart sounds. So those are things that go on the encounter form. This is kind of a representation of a paper form. Of course, now these are nearly always electronic. And here's an example of a charge master. Note it's a hospital, right? Department code for radiology in this facility is 01-855. We have the surface code, right? The chest x-ray, it's a single view, the revenue code, the CPT code, the charge, and the relative value unit, which in other words, how intensive it was. And this is covered in depth, and we'll be talking about this throughout the course. Claims forms. CMS 1500 forms are used to report professional and technical services. So in other words, if somebody's interpreting a diagnostic test, being seen in the office, being worked up for the first time as a new patient, medical office will use the CMS 1500 form. The UB04 form is generated by a hospital or other healthcare settings for the facility charges, right? So a lot of times when patients are talking about bills, it's which bill are you talking about? Are you talking about the 1500 claim form or the UB04? When we talk about accepting assignment, the provider agrees to accept whatever the insurance pays. So if they don't pay what is fully on their fee schedule, that is what it is. We also hear the term out-of-pocket payment provisions, and these are hard limits that are established by the insurance company. And when the patient has reached that limit for the year, the health insurance plan determines what the reimbursement will be to the medical office. Again, another thing we talk about is accounts receivable. Of course, those are things that we have outstanding in terms of things to be billed, but we haven't been actually paid for them in the medical practice for a number of reasons. Could be that we don't have pre-authorization, could be that we don't have encounters coded, all these different types of things. And your book makes the point with this 1,500 claim form. This is what they look like in paper, right? The health insurance specialist completes the claim, and once they have a signature on file, they can put that in the appropriate field on this form. And one of the biggest reasons that claims get denied is that they're not accurate. They don't, mainly in terms of not being complete and all these different types of things. And that's what I have for you. We'll be taking a closer look at chapter 4, which gets into finer details about the revenue cycle process and revenue management. We'll see you then. Bye now.